Hello and welcome back, this is ProTaleDev back with another Dungeon Farm Tycoon game, and what we're going to be looking at is some of the newer stuff that I've done in the last 2 to 3 weeks. It's actually been a while since I've recorded. That is partly to do with the game jam. I think I recorded my last video pretty much at the start of the game jam, and I've had a bit of time I've had to edit some of the game jam stuff. I've also had some issues with the Turtle Trials last video, the last coding video, and it's just been kind of a bit of a mess, so I'm actually going to have to re-record that last video because I've just encountered tons of issues with it and it's just not usable. Anyway, to start off with today, we're going to go over some of the fixes first, then the changes, and then we'll go over the new stuff. We'll end the video on the newer stuff. And like I said, there's a lot, so let's get straight into it. So the first thing that I had to fix was the fact that when the monsters died, their collision would kind of bring out an error. I couldn't really figure out why. It turns out it was something very simple and straightforward. It's because the component was the Box Collider, not Box Collider 2D. I didn't have the 2D on there, and so it wasn't giving me an error because it was not an issue. It was still detecting a collide. But the problem was it was the wrong type of collision, and so it would bring up an error. So that's now fixed whenever the monster dies. That was a tricky one to find because it was such a simple solution, so I overthought it and just did not notice the 2D. It sounds silly, but that was the issue. The next issue was to do with rooms while in the editor. For some reason I wasn't able to delete the rooms after I placed them down. I think that was because I was going to add in the ability to separate, specifically delete rooms with a different button, while monsters and things would be still the standard delete. This was so that you weren't accidentally deleting the rooms as well as monsters. However, for now I've just I've left it as it is, and I've just fixed it. That also gives me a chance to show off the other issue that I fixed, and that is if I just quickly create these rooms now. And then add in some monsters, let's say this guy, and maybe, I don't know, this guy, any one of these monsters. Before, these weren't showing in here, they weren't showing correctly, now they are. So before, I couldn't actually place these down, you wouldn't be able to see them. That's now fixed. The next fix to talk about is to do with the path targeting. So previously it was targeting continuously different targets. So it would actually generate a target and then it would just choose one at random, and this, you would end up getting like a swaying motion as it chose. As it would get closer and closer to the original target, it would choose the other one and it would force it to continuously move. That's now fixed. It's only targeting one specific target. That was just some minor changes in the code, and instead of updating the target continuously in an update, now it just chooses a target and then I just use a bool to say that it's false until it gets to it. Simple enough. I don't really need to show the code for something like that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the changes, and the first thing that I've done is I've quickly made a little dungeon here. I've come into the large dungeon section and I'm going to just place down some monsters, maybe just 2 or 3. Actually, let's just do 2 monsters, and then what I can do is I can pause the game once they're in there. So let's do this one over here and this one over here, and then what we can do is we can quickly go in. Okay, and once I'm in the dungeon, let me quickly show you what this is. So if I quickly pause it, what I can do is I can go to the player immediately and just quickly zoom in here, and immediately you'll see the effect. So we've got our level here, but we've also got our effect. So this is Burning Shield. Now Burning Shield is what this enemy can do, the young devil. We've probably spent the most time on him, so it's the easiest to show, but yeah, Burning Shield is the effect. And this is just a little hint at to the player to see what they do. Now over here we have our stone golem. It's a bit dark at the moment, but the effect is the auto sentry, which makes sense because if we play, obviously we have his shield there, and if we come across here, we have the sentry that gets sent. Of course, our stone golem moves very slow, but we have our sentry that follows. And all of the monsters have this as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly show the code. Quickly go up here. You'll immediately notice this code is quite a bit different now with the monster stats. That's because I'm detecting what the dungeon size is. inside of the dungeon, whatever dungeon they're spawned in, and basically I'm altering their stats because of that. Down here though you have the monster effect, and you can see what they're called. So for the plant troll we have the plant slam, for the dark mage we have the dark void, we have for the skull walker we have the weak chains, for the orc shaman we have the healing charm, for the orc fighter we have the knockout, for the orc scout we have the charging, for the goblin we have the spike trap, for the mud monster we have the tar mud, for the slime, the green slime, we have the slippy slime. For the stone golem we have the auto sentry. For the thin bone we have the bone wall. For the water drop we have the geyser burst. For the prime devil we have the inferno ball. For the flesh devil we have the fire orb. For the young devil we have the burning shield. And these are the effects that they do pretty much. This is just a hint again to players. It's just a slight change. So the next change that I did is to do with the rigid body. So what I've done is I've added mass. I've altered the mass and adjusted it for the monsters. So the player's mass is still 1, but what I've done with all the monsters is I've changed it to 0.9. This means that the player can push the monsters if they get trapped. So if the player is trapped in a corner and they can't get out, they should be able to push the monsters a little bit. The next thing that's changed is also the fact that you can only leave at the ladders now at the entrance of the dungeon. So you have to come back, you can't just leave whenever you want, and that's just by clicking this button down here. So if you do that, you'll actually leave the dungeon. When you're inside the editor, you can now also view your managers. So you can go into your managers and be able to edit and change what you have. This will be useful because you're the one designing the dungeon, so maybe you want to have a specific area for a certain enemy and you want to try certain weapons and stuff out. You can just go straight into your character, or you can go into your crafting. And this is also good because crafting can take quite a long time through the alchemy table, the blacksmith forge, or just in general making those equipment can take a while. So being able to just make stuff while you're in the editor, I think is just an extra handy quality of life thing. And the last change is that no longer will the houses need gold to be maintained. It's only food and water. So and that means that it increases obviously with the houses, but it was too much to be able to remove gold as well. So now since everything's so expensive, it just felt like you would just lose so much gold. Okay, so now let's move on to the new things. So first of all, I'm going to show you the new inspection button that's at the bottom in the managers. I'm just bringing out a few bits and pieces that produce a resource, like some of these. And immediately what you're going to notice, just put that there. For the mines, the lumber, the food and water, which are the production aspect of the game and produce resources, what you'll be able to do now is you'll be able to see this button at the bottom here. It kind of looks like a hammer with a grid on it, which is what I was going for. And essentially what this is inspection. So what this inspection button does is just as it sounds. When you click it, you'll be able to see how much your bar is going down. You'll be able to see all your values, and you'll also be able to see the grid. And this means you can also use it while you're building if you want. The grid does come on automatically when you're building, but this allows you to also be able to see the bars and the progress. You can also turn them off if it gets distracting. So the next big thing is in our character inventory. So these effects are now completed at the bottom, these armor effects. So with the villager, the knight, the dragonkin and the wizard, they all have their own individual specific effect, and that is now completed. It's finished. If you equip these as you are now, as long as you select, it is working. The first one is to be able to pick up 5% more gold. Again, that's working. The knight is to take less damage from monsters. Next is the dragonkin, which is less exhaustion. Water and food will be taken less. The next one is the magic cloth, which is the robe, which enchants weapons with extra durability. So yeah, these upgrades, these effects, the equipment is now completely working. This means that the weapons, potions and armor is all finished and there's nothing to do for it, including the character inventory, that's also finished. So the next thing I want to cover is to do with the dungeons themselves. Now this next one is really big. It took a very long time to redesign this, but I've decided to completely change the dungeon manager script and completely optimize it. So what I mean by completely redesign is just as it sounds. If you look at the code as it is now, we're only, if we count all the way at the bottom, it's 110 lines of code. Now this specific script actually went all the way up to almost 3,000 lines of code. Now you didn't see a lot of that code over the last 3 weeks, but I really spent a long time on this script, and I discovered that the amount of code that I was adding in was just so unoptimized and so poor, at a loss with how ineffective it was and how much lines of code I was wasting. Of course, so I had to optimize it. And as you can see, now the manager is only this big, and there is a big reason for that. So previously we had our manager work getting references to UI, spawning it in, handling it all through different slots, and we'd only allow 6 slots specifically for per dungeon. We also had to categorize it as their own ones, and then alter certain bools and determine which is active and which one isn't. It made it very complicated. There was tons and tons of references to tons of buttons, tons of bools. It became way too complex and unnecessarily complex. It also meant that I encountered a lot of issues later when trying to reference individual monsters or reference specific runes for specific dungeons. Things just got really complex. So basically the manager now only is built for exiting the dungeon, which is right here, which is just a summary of kind of all the different camera effects and stuff, and switching cameras, coming out and changing the state. And then we have the lighting, which is handled in here, and of course we have the different states, of course, that are handled in here, which is handled in this script, which I get a reference from whenever I need it to other scripts. And this is just the basics, handling the exit button really, and the selection point. It's really summarized now to just the lighting and the exit, and not really a whole lot of control within the dungeons, and that's perfect because we don't want to control every single dungeon's mechanics and every single piece of monster, every reference in this script. As you can see, this is just some of the references the buttons and things I've left in that were in use, now no longer in use, like handling all the locks and things. This is just not necessary. I'm actually going to remove a lot of this because it's not necessary anymore. But then what has happened with all the code? Where's all the code gone? If I've optimized this one, then some of the code must be there. What is handling the dungeons? And the simple answer is that now, instead of our dungeons being considered a separate things, so instead of the UI for the dungeons, the dungeon itself, when the prefab that's built into the overworld on the island, and the dungeon that is in its editor, they were all completely separate. Now they're one single entity, they're one single thing. So if I go into my dungeons here, you'll see that this is now blank. This is because it's so zoomed out because it's huge, but these are the castles. Now if I go to my scene here, immediately you're going to see right down here that our castle that we bring in, which was its own object, is now down here. This is where it usually standard is, and what's going to happen is when this spawns in, it's actually going to spawn the dungeon with it instead of spawning it separately. To be honest, this saved so much code, and honestly it's just a way better idea is to just spawn it in with this object rather than having a ton of code for it, handling it, referencing different things, managing it. Instead, all we do is just spawn the dungeon in with it, and just make sure it's positioned far enough away, the same as all the other dungeons. Since we're deactivating and activating dungeons whenever we access the buttons, the new UI, it can deactivate other dungeons whenever we need by just getting a reference to what's active, and that makes it so much easier in the manager because all we do is reference this current dungeon prefab. So all we do is just reassign the current dungeon prefab as a new object of this, whenever we access a specific dungeon. This means we can have as many dungeons as we want. We don't need 6 slots. We don't need to access a UI. We don't need a manager anymore. We can just access whatever dungeon we want. So if I just quickly press play here and show you, if we go into our dungeon manager now, this is still blank, but you can see now that it no longer works if we add in a bunch of dungeons. This is because we can now have as many as we want, and we don't have to have a ridiculous manager to handle it all. We can just kind of just go in whenever with the freedom. So if I were to just place this down, you can see in here that we've got no dungeon. So this manager is going to be removed. It just isn't necessary anymore. But how then do we access our editor? How do we go in? How have I been doing that? And that is because these castles have their own built-in canvas within it that appears on the HUD when you first access it, and that's controlled, and that only appears when the building has been selected. So using the already pre-built code for the building, we already have the selection working for all this already, so no new code was needed to select it. All I do is just select the castle, and down here we have this new UI that allows us to enter the dungeon. Don't know if it's going to stay like that, but for now it is. And all I do is you have the name, you have the size, and all you do is go into the editor, and then boom, we're in our own dungeon. Any other dungeon has been deactivated, this one is now active, and any monsters that will spawn will be put in the current active dungeon. Of course, we can leave with this new button. This is also, I mentioned it previously that this button was here. But we can leave straight away. We can also, of course, edit whenever we want, and we can just go into here, and we can always just access it again if we need to. And once the editor is done, we can go into our adventure. If I were to spawn in a different dungeon and then go into here, you can see that while it does say adventure on here, you can just go back into the editor and it will be different. So if I just build that there and then come out and then go into this one and go back into editor, you can see that it is in fact different. So already it's much more convenient and much more different. All I need to do is just go over it. I've paused the game currently, so as you can see there's nothing active at the moment, and that's because we're not in it. So it shows that the adventure is where the dungeons are working, they're deactivated, you don't need them. So most of the code for the dungeon manager is now in this code right here, but there's also only just coming up to 100 lines of code needed. This means that we have we've simplified this script so much that we've removed, like I said, up to 2,000 to 3,000 lines of code, repeated code. This is going to make the game so much more smoother in the long run, especially if you have as many dungeons as you want. Of course the game will start slowing down, but it's better than just having 6. So all this is doing is handling the UI, whether it's active or not, whether we're again detection, this is the code we use just to bring up the building UI upgrade. So we use that same detection method to be able to turn our UI on and off, and because it's a reference to its own castle and we're only going to be selecting that one, all I have to do is get a reference to its own UI easily. We've already got a reference to the states, so all we do is determine what state they're in and whether we've edited is completed or not, and just go in here and turn the buttons on or off. Simple enough. That handles the UI. Again, edit and start adventure are the only codes we need. As prior before, we needed 4 different aspects and a 5th to handle insignificant appearances of UI. And the 4 was the edit, the exit, the start adventure and end adventure. Now we only need a reference to these 2 buttons, and then the exit button is handled in the manager. Okay, let's move on to the very, very last thing. And to show this off, it's going to take a little bit of time, so I'm just going to briefly go through them. And that is the attacks are now in the game. So if I just go to monster and attacks, a lot of the players' attacks are in here that are ranged. And yeah, so the ranged weapons are now completed. So we have the air pierce, the throwing axe, the dagger. We also have the scorched staff, the life staff, and the water staff, wind blade as well. And what these do is, if I quickly go to the player and I'll just spawn them in, let me turn off the canvas, and I'll just spawn these in because they already have their scripts set up, so hopefully shouldn't be getting any errors. If I just throw these in, so if I just do that and then hold it here, if I bring in a bunch of these daggers, you'll see them quickly fly in, and this is just the player throwing it in one direction. On the player we actually have a target's position, so in here and I believe in weapon hold, we have a weapon based target. This is for some weapons that can only be thrown in one direction, so what will happen is that the weapon gets spawned on the player whenever they attack. I'll show this code in a minute, and all it does is spawn it with the target. It's going for this target specifically, which is just in front of the player. There's a slight bit of movement because of the animation, which I kind of like. I like that it's not 100% guaranteed to go straight in front of the player. It's really based on angles, but basically if it'll always throw it about here, so it'll just go towards the target. It'll be slightly different variations, which I think is going to be quite cool, but ultimately it'll go in the same direction. Of course it's moving a little bit all over the place because I'm just throwing it into the world, so it's just trying to find the target, but basically it should be in that direction. Now the axe also has the same functionality, but it'll do a lot more damage. It's a little bit slower, but when it hits the monster it will disappear just like the knife and do damage, but just way more. So these two are relatively simple. Then let's move on to the wind blade. So the wind blade is much more interesting. You can see it for a second. If I just throw it into the world again, slight issues because at the moment it's trying to find a target because I'm just throwing it in. Usually when I spawn it in, it'll assign all the targets and stuff like that, but essentially you can see what it is. It's a gust of wind that will, every time you slash your weapon, your wind blade, it will create this wind either on the ground. I haven't decided if I want it to move towards the closest monster or if I want it to just stay still on the ground. I kind of like it staying on the ground because then you can move around and kite around it almost like a trap. So I'm thinking of doing that with it. So that's the only one I'm not 100% sure, and it's not 100% finished yet, but that's okay. Next is the air pierce. The air pierce, even though it's sideways, its rotation is determined by where it is, where it spawns. But essentially, what this does is it is a really quick blade, but it's going to go through multiple enemies. It's just going to continue to go through enemies. Unlike the previous ones, they will get destroyed when they hit an enemy. Apart from maybe the wind blade, I think again might be a trap, so it'll do less damage. So it's more like a damage zone that we have. But this guy is going to go through multiple enemies and continue going. It's not just going to disappear after hitting an enemy like the axe and dagger. Oh, also these are also getting destroyed after a certain amount of time. So yeah, next one is the staffs. Hopefully I'm not missing any. So let's start off with the I'd say probably the weakest potentially one, which is the staff that does this effect. So it's a little bit hard to see, so I'm going to zoom right in, but essentially remember there is going to be a staff that is in effect. In fact, let's just quickly activate it just so you can see what it looks like. So here it is, the axe. We do also have the split blade, but it's already been set up. The animation was done a while ago, and I have shown that in a previous video, so I'm not showing it now. So the split blade is another ranged weapon that is done already. But here we have the water staff. It'll do its animation and it'll do this effect. So this bubble. What this means is that any enemy that is in here is actually going to be a lot slower, so next to the player, giving the player a bit of time. But also this bubble beam is going to push any enemies away quite far. This could be a really convenient and really good weapon if you're in a really bad situation where you can't get out of the way or you're stuck, and you can use this to push enemies away or even dodge an attack. Next effect that I'm going to show is the life staff. The life staff is, let me just activate the staff just to show it off. The light staff is going to have this sparkling effect on it, and what it's going to do is When you activate it, I haven't decided if it's going to give you a shield or if it's going to drain the life of creatures around them, or if it's just going to heal you, do it like a free heal. The other option is that it could teleport you. I haven't fully decided on what to do for this effect at the moment, but I'll just show you what it actually does in terms of effects. So if I activate it, let's say we activate it, what will happen is this beam will fire up. Of course it does get destroyed shortly after, but it'll fire up like this, and you'll just see a bright light, so it's really obvious that it's happened. Now we have our final staff, which is my favourite and probably the most strongest in the entire game, which is the Scorch staff. So let's activate it. Again, see some fire, some embers around the tip of the staff, and what will happen is when you activate it, when you attack, this effect will happen. So there'll be an explosion and you'll see a shockwave of embers. So boom, and a shockwave. This is by far my favourite effect, and like I said, it's very, very cool. You can use multiple attacks, and this is just going to hit any enemy around you and then scorch them and hurt them a lot, but only on the initial hit, not continuously. This video is already quite long, so I'm trying to hurry up as best I can. There was just so much to show. So if I go in the player items equip, you'll see that these effects are down here. All they're doing is just spawning them in, and then this is just activating whenever they attack. So this is the cast trigger, so it's still working, it's still animating them, and then in the same time it's determining how much damage they're going to do based on what has been selected and fired, and it spawns in the specific effect. So that's been everything with Dungeon Farm Tycoon. As you can see, I'm starting to get closer and closer to finishing this game. I wanted this done, like I mentioned, by the end of either probably next week now or the week after, and I want this done preferably at the beginning of December, towards the end of this month. I'm getting awfully close though. The dungeon is pretty close to finishing, and the monsters are also starting to get closer and closer to finishing. So there's certainly a lot of things that are done, and now we're just getting to the idea of maybe adding more objectives and adding more levels. So that'll be kind of the thing I'll be looking at next. So this has been ProTaleDev, and I'll see you next time.